Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this webinar today, from editor's desk to author's hands, what tools make possible. Before I kind of introduce our speakers, I want to take a moment to talk about why we thought it was important to have this conversation and open up this series of conversations, which will be a number of webinars dedicated to the topic of pre-submissions checks. So if you currently work in an editorial office, you're almost certainly seeing a lot more submissions than you did a year ago. And if you're an author, the experience on your side probably feels a bit different too. Whether that's because there are more journals to choose from, more guidelines to parse, or more compliance boxes to tick, oftentimes your manuscript comes back desk rejected within days without much explanation of why. A few months ago, Tim Vines wrote a piece in A Scholarly Kitchen that puts some of this reality into numbers. The industry is now collecting somewhere in the order of 15 million submissions a year and around 4.5 million articles published, which is about a 30% acceptance rate. And to add to that, many publishers have made number of submissions a critical health indicator, which also has some inherent downsides. For example, there's the cost of processing more manuscripts, especially in the context of editorial operations, weeding out the good from the bad. And there has subsequently been a lot of talk about moving many of these quality assurance checks upstream. However, there's also an inherent tension in this because moving some of those upstreams might have a negative impact on the submission number health metric, because doing more gatekeeping at submission would inevitably lead to a reduction of submissions as well. So today we facilitated a conversation with a few people who sit in various positions across the publishing landscape, with unique vantage points on navigating this issue. So first we have Beth Cronin, Director of Editorial Ops at APS, Krishna Chap, Head of Editorial Dev at Karger, and Shui Guo, the postdoctoral researcher at Radboud University. So to all of our speakers, thank you so much for coming. I'm looking forward to this discussion. So the first question I wanted to throw to Shui, and I'd love to hear from all of you, but I'll start with you, is in your experience, where does the submission process actually break down first?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it could start from the very beginning of your writing, but could also be the exact moment when you open up the actual submission page. Personally, I've had instances where from the very beginning, which we want to submit to. So we wrote the paper keeping in mind the requirements of that journal. But I've also had instances where we kind of wanted to see where how far our paper goes, like the final shape of the paper first. In that case, we focused on just getting the paper written first before we choose a journal. So yeah.
All right. Beth?
Yeah. So in my experience, you tend to look at the breakdown as probably maybe very along the lines, that we just heard about, but more where I think of it is really often in the journal selection, and that, authors are making really high stakes decisions based on maybe inconsistent or overly generic information related to journal scope, things like that. I think when authors may think that their paper might be a reasonably fit, in their heads they might think that, but from an editor's perspective, they may be applying more specific criteria to decisioning, things like scope, novelty, maybe even audience criteria, and when they're selecting manuscripts to go out to peer review. So by the time really a manuscript reaches that submission, many of the issues that kind of we see might already be baked in the reality. So I think that process starts, pretty soon. And again, I think in the determination of where authors like Zhou Sui said that either it's maybe not in the front end of writing the paper, but definitely as they kind of develop the paper and then make a decision of where they want to submit their publication.
And Krishna?
Yeah, I agree with my co-panelist there. I think one thing I could add is I think it's very often, as Cherie said, that you have a journal in mind when you start writing a paper, or when you your research might take a slightly different direction, or might change focus as you progress, and so it might be useful to maybe also rethink about whether that's still the right journal, whether the focus of your research has maybe a little bit has shifted, and therefore maybe another venue might be a little bit more appropriate, as they might want to focus on something more clinical or anything related. So I think it's definitely, it can still be relevant, but I think it could be also an assessment that you can review with time as your research progresses, and as your discussion and as your writing also may evolve over time.
All right, thank you all for that. I will also say, for anyone joining, we'll do Q&A, and anytime you want to pop any questions in, feel free to do that. So Shui, zooming into the author experience, when you're deciding where to submit, what information do you actually need, and how hard is it to find? Do you kind of think the publishing process and that particular process in general is getting easier or more complicated as time goes on?
Yeah, so these days, it's good that many journals already voluntarily display metrics like impact factors, site scores, and like average waiting time on their web pages. But that is only one side of the story for us authors, I think. So personally, I would also check where studies directly related to my work tend to be found. Are they concentrated in a certain small amount of journals? And I would also seek advice from my advisor and other researchers, more senior members of the group, on their recommendations and their past experience with that specific journal. And it's hard to say whether this is getting easier or more complicated, but given the amount of journals, the amount of choices out there, this is certainly a time-consuming process if you absolutely have no idea where to start with. For example, if you are new to this field, or if your work is multidisciplinary, then this can be a hard choice.
All right, so assuming to kind of navigate even where to publish them before you even get into the submission process itself.
Yes.
So just then, kind of to follow up on that, just what for you, what makes the journal a right fit, or what is going on in your thought process for that?
Yeah, so besides what I just mentioned, like people's like personal recommendations and experiences, I would also want to know like the reputation of the journal and the publisher for sure. And also very important is whether the journal has the right audience for our work. And I would also like to browse a few recent issues of that journal to see what are the recent topics and style of the paper being published there, to get a sense of whether we're fitting there.
Right. And then for Beth and Krishna, as we heard there, does that accurately reflect on your side for incoming manuscripts? Or in other words, does it seem like people are struggling to find the right fit, or does it seem like people are on it and kind of know the process?
Yeah, Kristen, do you want to jump in first? I'll give you the first stab at this one.
Thanks for that. Yes, I think it, in our experience, it definitely reflects what Drew has said. I think there are several aspects to it. Typically, you have several co-authors, right, of the paper, so they have to also agree, among each other as to where they want to publish. We've heard, or we hear very often that people like to see whether they can find similar papers in the journal, right? They then are reassured that this is of interest to the editors of the journal. They typically also look at, and I think you mentioned some of it, at the editorial board members members, if they recognize some of the names, or those people that they recognize because they have worked with them, they have seen them at conferences, or they know of their work, so that they also then have a better sense of whether that is in scope and whether that is the focus of the journal. So that's typically, as we know that researchers tend to choose journals that they are familiar with, and that can be different things. Either they have already published, or they, if they have not published, especially if they are very early in their career, they tend to read papers in those journals, right? So I think there's definitely about familiarity with the journal, but also familiarity with who might be handling their paper and who might be the right sort of experts to assess their paper.
Yeah, and pretty similar in my experience in this space. I think I would add in that, depending on the technical domain or academic community that the researcher comes from, has a big impact in journal selection. What we're hearing today, which was really fascinating to hear, is like the amount of time, effort, and energy that researchers probably put into decisioning. And again, even just going out and making sure you look at previous issues, the audience, taking that all into consideration. Those are things that I've heard over my tenure in this industry. The other thing I would say too, in terms of determining submission, is really kind of taking a look at, the recommendations that people make around you and the people that you're connected with, whether it be the people that you're collaborating with on the paper, associated with that overall. So I think, again, really aligns well with exactly what we've heard today from, how researchers and why they select what journals to pick and submit with, and also based on reputation too.
So we heard the concept of finding similar papers in a journal. What processes or tools exist to help someone do that? Or how does that actual process work? That's for anybody.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Jump in. I think you're the expert on this one for sure, from the user perspective.
Yeah, so basically, as a researcher, we read a lot of papers before we start writing. So when we read all those prior studies, where they kind of have a sense of where they tend to be published. So I kind of know like a few big names in my field. That's how we start. Like this can of course help with narrowing down the selection, but of course we're also open to new journals because there are also new journals, baby journals being created all the time. So we also check those. But of course, if similar studies or like our collaborators already published some papers and they know these are the most likely places where we can publish, then we will take that advice most likely for sure.
Beth, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of like tools that are coming out, I think the thought process is really looking at finding a tool or way to give authors or, researchers the ability to understand what the scope is of the journal. And again, I think those areas, what is really the editorial board looking for to publish within the respect to, the manuscript associated. So, journal scope is one that you hear a little bit in the industry right now, associated with tools and, giving authors the potential ability to give the, greater insight as to the type of content that they're looking for. So.
Right. So switching gears just slightly to think about maybe more from the publisher perspective, what kind of issues are most common when you first get a submission, when it first leaves the researcher's hand? And yeah, how is that associated with high desk rejection rates or increased costs on your side?
Go ahead,
And that
Chris.
could be
I'll
sorry,
let
I
you
should have
jump in
called on
first.
someone.
That's okay.
I get started. Thank you. Yes, I think it's useful to separate maybe sort of two categories of things that are important. I think there are the things that are important, but can be dealt with later on. And I think it's anything to do with format and things like that I think more and more publishers definitely are trying to sort of deal with a little bit later, because that's something that is not crucial to the initial assessment of the manuscript necessarily. And I think that's one category. But I think the main challenge that we see is with things that are really crucial to even the initial assessment of the manuscript. And the typical issues that we see and that may lead to desk rejections can be things around scope, for instance. I mean, we talked about trying to understand a little bit more, and depending on your familiarity with the journal, that might be a challenge. Now, I appreciate that sometimes all the journals will have their scope well defined on their homepage and things like that. Depending on how familiar you are with it, you could interpret it in different ways, right? So reading more papers from that journal could also give you a little bit more sense, but that is definitely sometimes one challenge that we see. Sometimes things around article types that we will have, we will also see very often. Not all journals consider all article types. If it is your work, your article type is maybe very specific, it might be that journal is not considered. And another example that is also comes very often is the absence or the lack of clarity around ethical statements, for instance. So we publish a lot of medical content, and so that might be where we do need to have that information even for the initial assessment, and therefore the lack of information or maybe missing information there might lead also to a rejection at that point. So that's things that are, I would say, much more crucial than the formatting, whether it's this parallel, this section is before this section or not, so that we really separate things there.
Yeah. And just, on the same lines, we see a lot of the same similar aspects in terms of thinking about a manuscript not being suitable, and common issues that, again, scope is probably one of the largest one, and the mismatch of that it doesn't align either with the audience or the priorities of a given journal. Things like insufficient novelty or maybe impact, and again, solid work, but again, maybe at that time the journals made a decision that it doesn't meet the level expected for that particular venue. Maybe positioning problems, that the science might be strong, but maybe it's not framed in a way that it makes the contribution clear to the specific readership. And then I think, as Krishna talked about, the formatting compliance issues, that it exists, but maybe it's not it's a rare reason for the immediate desk rejection. But again, you want to ensure that the manuscript is really ready for peer review, and that anything around compliance issues are related to the business aspects of what's needed for that next step in the process overall. So and I just want to piggyback off what Kristen was saying, is that, again, I think you start to see the rate of desk rejections grow a little bit more as now us as publishers are taking a look at things from an integrity perspective, and there could be a relationship to there as we continue to see some of those rates grow overall, just based on potential issue that may not align from an integrity compliance issue. So.
Right. So we had a question from the outside, which I want to bundle together with something that was just mentioned. So the question is, do you foresee AI changing the journal selection process? And then I also want to maybe tie that to what we would like to surface to authors at submission versus things that we think should remain in peer review, because I think there is a tension there. I think, Beth, you mentioned novelty and impact. So we could say, yeah, sure, wouldn't it save everyone's time is if right when you uploaded your manuscript at submissions, you immediately got feedback saying there's a low likelihood this is going to be accepted because it's really not that novel enough for this journal. But on the other side, is that the world we want to create? Is that going to be acceptable? Do we want to have that level of AI intelligence built into the submissions process? Do people trust that? Would authors go for it? So I'll open up that can of worms.
Lots of questions, Anthony, that you're putting out there. Um, I do think that AI has a role to play where it can make the process faster, and give more indications, especially on the completeness side of, one of the things that we're doing at APS right now is working very closely with an industry partner, Cactus, to build in the submission form, essentially, identifying certain things that might not meet certain criteria right away. Things that you typically see where you would send something back to the author, kind of waste some of the in-between time, the back and forth. And so what we're trying to do is and give, well, again, the tendency to say, we've built an environment in this industry where we don't want to create friction for authors, or we want to remove the blockers, but sometimes those blockers aren't a bad thing, and that, you want to be able to also cut that back and forth. And on average in my career, I've seen that we've sent manuscripts on average back and forth to an author 2 to 3 times, and think about the time that's wasted in that process. So where can AI and some of these tools play a role to give the author the guidance they need up front? Because at the end of the day, we all do things just a little bit differently. And we know that authors are publishing in many journals across many publishers. And so with that, if we can give, the ability to walk through and give clear guidance as someone is submitting a manuscript, I mean, how amazing would that be to, help that turnaround time and help remove that friction to a degree of the back and forth?
Yeah, Krishna or Shuei?
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. I think we've been, I think the current tools that we have are getting better and better at really trying to minimize those avoidable sort of issues that we mentioned, so that anything that is, is it a matter of the statement is missing or not missing? Have you thought about including this in line of the journal guidelines, for instance, so that we avoid indeed those back and forth that Beth was mentioning. And so where it's relatively straightforward to sort of define what is and what isn't necessary at this point. So I think we're trying, it is, and some tools are there and increasingly doing well at helping the authors to already see that before they even really hit the final submit button. And I think that is saving time further down the line, definitely for the submissions. I think they will get a little bit better. I think some of them, in some cases, for instance, now we're talking about, for instance, the ethics statement, for instance, and information around ethics approvals and things like that. Tools are very good at saying, is a statement present or not? It's a little bit sometimes more difficult to assess whether this is the correct statement that you need to have. Of course, some of the study types might be a little bit more complex than than most, and that is maybe where the tools can still improve a little bit. But I think to your point on sort of the assessment of scope and things like that, I think at this point we're not there yet. Whether that's going to be something that could be, for the moment, I would still imagine that, in the end, this is a sort of a subjective assessment too, right, to some extent. So I think you could imagine that an AI tool could give a preliminary assessment, or give a sort of opinion to the authors as to whether that is a good fit, whether maybe the presentation and the arguments could be presented in a certain way to better fit the style or of the goals of the journal, so that would support maybe the paper a little bit more when then being assessed by the editor or sort of any other sort of human. So I could imagine something that might be complementary to that. Whether that's going to replace it entirely, I think is still an open question at this point.
Right. So representing all researchers across the planet, Shuei, what is your appetite for this type of thing, or how do kind of think through this tension?
Yeah, I think AI can certainly be helpful in many ways. Although I wouldn't let AI to do all the decision, but for example, I think one thing that AI can certainly do is maybe, for example, if the publishers can make an interactive questionnaire using AI, and this is mainly to help those who are not really sure where they want to submit to. So maybe they can design a few questions, like answer a few questions to help you choose a journal, and that can include questions like what type of the paper it is. Is it a review paper, a methodological paper, or like maybe things like those, and maybe ask the author to also put in some keywords so that AI can pull in all the information to help them narrow down, like give them maybe like 5, 6 journals to look into instead of, because right now, for example, I look at one publisher, I look at like if I hit the submit a journal, then submit to a journal, then I see like 100 different options. I don't even know where I want to begin if I have no idea. Like, of course, like some authors, they're very determined from the very beginning where they want to submit to. They can choose not to use the journal, but something like a questionnaire could be helpful for those that are still kind of deciding, yeah, maybe this is good, maybe not. Like the scope, like Beth and Krishna mentioned.
Right, right. That makes sense. So in terms of maybe more on the so you mentioned Krishna, the sort of crucial aspects versus the non-crucial aspects maybe at submissions. But what about so I guess maybe I've always thought of it as things that authors are ultimately responsible for, like are all the images there? So maybe that's not crucial in the sense of like for a decision, but wouldn't it be a more convenient time to just kind of take care of those missing gaps at submission? So to think about a more holistic kind of pre-flight check on the submission process. And basically the question is, have you going down that route? I mean, and have you noticed any pushback on researchers in wanting to go through those extra steps, and maybe, as I see it, sort of moving friction, some of the friction from editorial operations to maybe more friction on the researcher, but that friction might be actually mutually beneficial. So for the author or researcher, maybe they get to an answer sooner, or maybe they increase their acceptance chances, et cetera. So can you just walk me through how you're approaching that currently? Beth, I'll start with you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I am personally in the mindset that I think we have an opportunity to just take a look at how we're doing this differently over time. I do think that we did want to, as an industry, make it as easy as possible for authors, right? And so, in many ways, you've kind of pushed those things downstream. And, again, when I think about what's important to authors at the end of the day, it's, they want to get their paper into a journal. They want to get it peer reviewed. And then once it's accepted, they want to get it out to publication. So, the faster we can think about from a turnaround perspective, I think the better we're going to be, because we know many of us that have done some of this market research is that what's really important to authors and turnaround time is always in the top 3 in terms of expectations. So, we are thinking at APS about it in a way that, yes, it is also taking the onus off of us from an internal organization and really putting it back on the author, because at the end of the day, it will always have to go back to the author in making changes or updating things that in the manuscripts. So it's giving them, as we talked about, the guidance to make it easier and clearer to them as what's exactly needed, as we, what's expected of them in the various phases that they go through, that a paper goes through, especially going through the publication from submission to the production side of the house. So I'm of the mindset personally that if we can really help provide that guidance through tools and technology, I think it's going to just make that experience much faster and easier in many ways. we made a decision at APS to really build some of these tools directly into the submission form. So we're not using so much the pre-submit or pre-flight aspect of things. We're actually doing it directly in the system. But when you look at some of the case studies that have been done in the industry, you do see opportunities where papers are either in a better position and higher acceptance rates in journals that are using some of these tools out there, and partly because maybe again, they're coming in better suited from a grammar perspective and a language aspect of things, or they're just positioned better when they come in the door that editors can make a decision and move it forward. So I'm all of the mindset of like us taking a step back in the industry and really thinking differently about kind of where we're going in this and how we can really help authors through tools, guide them through this process.
Krishna? And
Yes, no, I completely agree. I think what we've been trying to do is also, I talked and you mentioned initially about what is sort of crucial and what is less crucial and can be dealt with later. But we've also tried to think a little bit, when you look at the things that we deem crucial, let's say for journals, we try to sort of say that, in many of the cases, an author is maybe going to submit at the end, their manuscript to 1 or 2 or 3 journals, right? It might not be in the first sort of choice necessarily. What we don't want is them having to rewrite and change everything each time, right? So we're trying to think, and to a certain extent, where possible, that for the things that we think are crucial, that those are things that the author will need anyway, even if they in the end are rejected and need to go elsewhere. And if we think about reporting guidelines, for instance, right, we deem those necessary for the initial assessment, but most of the other journals will also require that, right? So when we ask for this, then we think, okay, this is needed, for the submission for our journal, but this benefits the manuscript, overall, and therefore they are not wasting their time, if you will. The researchers can then, they have improved their reporting with that, and it will be useful when even if they resubmit elsewhere. So I think, as Beth was saying, as an industry, I think if we were to sort of be able to agree on the things that all of us deem crucial, that would also save a little bit of time, in the sense that most of those things will be the same across the journals, and that would also then help the researchers in focusing on things that are really important generally, and not just for that specific journal, if possible. I think to your point on where the friction, could be moved, to. We've seen, cases where we've tried to pair a little bit. I mean, obviously we have, author guidelines where there is a lot of information for authors, and we completely appreciate that. By trying to be, comprehensive, it is a lot of information, and it's difficult to digest that before you submit your manuscript. So what we've tried to do is indeed integrate that a little bit more into the submission system, so that when people submit for each of the, depending on the topics, if we talk about ethics, it will lead them back to that section that is related to that topic. If we're talking about article type, it will lead them to that section. So that is a little bit more digestible and also more pragmatic, so that they can look at that huge piece of information topic by topic, so that it is a little bit more doable for them. Similarly, I think we've partnered with others to try to, before submission, so when others have entered all their information, submitted all their files, that they can have a quick assessment as to possibly, and that is an AI tool, is this missing, is this correct, or so that it reminds them a little bit, and maybe it might be fine and they double check, but the tool will help them to maybe think of things that may be not as clear as they could be, or that maybe they have missed and forgotten, possibly, and so that helps them a little bit, so that when they submit, so it does take a little bit more time, but we found that authors would rather spend a little bit more time there, But when they submit, that there's less of back and forth between the editorial office and themselves, because that takes, in the end, much more time.
Yeah, any human touch going back and forth to all the small things, a lot of days and weeks can fall into that. Uh, Sue, what's your perspective on what you've heard from Beth and Krishna?
Yeah, so as an author, I of course do my best to ensure my manuscript holds up to the standards of the journal. But once we hit the submission button, everything goes up in the air, and everything beyond that is out of our control. So then we are completely depending on the editorial office to communicate any issues or news to us in a timely manner. And as an author, I would be a little frustrated if we wait after 2, 3 weeks and get a response from the auditor saying, like Beth said, you need to fix your grammar, or maybe say something like, paper is too long, you need to shorten it. I would be a little bit frustrated. So I think if the pre-submission tools can already detect these kind of issues, because these kind of issues doesn't really need very intelligent AI to figure out, right? And if they can already inform us of these issues when we do the submission, this will make life easier, I think, for both authors and editors.
Yeah. So then I also want to ask about, in a Tim Line article, there's what I mentioned at the top of the meeting, which is basically if a current industry metric is number of submissions, and it seems like a number of publishers that we talk to do have, number of submissions as sort of one of the metrics that they go by. Pushing any amount of friction up the chain to an author would inherently compromise that metric. And just kind of in your experience, how have you been navigating that conversation? And how do you see that conversation? Has it changed in the last few years, or is it something that's on the table again? And even this goes beyond sort of what we're talking about in pre-submission checks, but it's also um, I'm on the committee for the research for identity for STM, and thinking about, okay, like different often methods of verification for identity, and that would be another point of friction that we would be adding to the process. So it seems to me that as we start to push this stuff out, there's a danger that the number would go down, but everybody wants the number to go up. So
I think we as a industry, from a publisher perspective, if we can show the understanding of like the benefits to the research community as to the why, I think to me that's the value there of the helping people see what's in it for me is really kind of the big piece. And again, part of it comes down to metrics and being transparent about those. Most of us, I think, by us, I mean publishers look at time to submission to peer review, time to submission to publication, the relationship to all of that. And again, all of those things are, I think, really important to understand. But there's a lot of also nuances baked into those, large range, I think, numbers that happen. And if we can show value of, an impact that we've had by using tools and technology, even though there might be a new, as we say, friction point, maybe it's not friction when we, talk about it from a perspective that maybe it sped up the publication by 10 to 20 days. And so again, a lot of us are just starting to scratch the surface in this area to really get at looking at it differently. And, again, customer experience doesn't always mean easy in the sense of, I think even just hearing today, if we can help a researcher not delay a part of the process by a week or two, to me, I think that that's a positive win and it has a positive benefit on the researcher community in the end. From the business and editorial operations side, again, like I think you started out with, Anthony, at the top of this webinar, is that we are all dealing with an increase, right, in number of manuscripts coming in the door for a lot of our areas of technical domain. And so again, if we can show benefit to authors, to why we're making these changes, I think people understand, because it's happening in every other industry out there, in e-commerce, and the relationship to what governments are putting into play, even around, I've seen, things where passports will eventually go electronic. So in many ways, we're just kind of aligning with the ways of the world and where things are going, in my perspective.
Yeah, Krishna?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think it's clear to all sides that there's a lot of pressure. I mean, there was always a lot of pressure, but even more so on editors, on reviewers, and on authors to have their papers published on in time. And so I think having, it's not so much whether that's going to impact the submissions. Maybe it will, but at the end of the day, I think it's looking at, we should spend time and resources where it matters, right, and where it makes sense. And so I think if we can indeed help and avoid any sort of issues and delays where it can be resolved, then there's less, or at least there's more opportunities for reviewers and editors to then spend time on the papers and that are suitable for their journals, right? And I think the researchers and the authors would also want that. So I think it is about maybe redirecting where the efforts are. And so I think in the end, all sides would benefit from that. And while in the short term that might impact some numbers, ultimately I think the end goal would be a positive thing for the researchers and also for the publishers. So I think that's definitely something that could help with definitely at least the challenges that we see, particularly with the reviewers at the moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So moving from, we have a question pop in, and I think it's more fun to kind of do them as they come in. So moving sort of from the theoretical to the super practical, what figures do you as publishers look at to see if pre-check tools are improving submission quality? Or is it only rejection rate? So as we roll this out, how do we know it's working?
Yeah, so I can tell you from my end, we look at kind of a cost-based activity exercise. When you look at, again, what's on your checklist of things that you're spending time on, or a human, an individual is taking a look at, how long on average does it take that individual to process? So for example, let's use length checks. I know that was brought up in earlier from the researcher perspective. So again, one of the things that I know that we're doing right now at APS is that's an area where, again, why do we do length checks as a relationship to, in many ways, from a business perspective, the length of a paper, how many pages. Sometimes we use it for the relationship to costing out things in many ways, the article type, the type of article that it is. So the relationship to length checks, we still want to know that. But again, we're baking in an automation of length checks so that up front, it tells the researcher that how many, again, words that might be within a given paper. Doesn't stop them from submitting, but will come in, and that it gives that same information to our editors to make a determination based on the needs from us as a publisher. And so we knew that it takes so many minutes on average and how many papers coming in. That's a great way to look at from a perspective of, is it improving the relationship? Now, it may not be a quality aspect of the paper itself and the science of the paper, but it's a quality of making that process go faster, because that's one less time you spend time on. So again, And, as we think about, I think one of your earlier questions, Anthony, in this space about will we use AI tools to help create, a more value add on the quality aspect of things. I think a lot of that's to be determined, but I do know that from our perspective as a publisher, the value of the editor's perspective and a human set of eyes and human decisioning on that is really, where we're focused on as a publisher. So quality, I think, has a lot of different meanings to it. And in many ways, you can look at it from an activity and how much time you're spending on it. And that's some of the things that we're doing right now.
Krishna, same question. If you have anything to like to add.
Yes, no, absolutely. So I agree with what Beth has said. I think what on our side, on a more pragmatic sort of part for beyond the rejection rate, I think where we can, which is not always possible, but we look also at the reasons for the rejection, so that could help you also have a sense of whether your tool is helping, whether that is with language, for instance. So we had a tool, an AI tool helping with improving the quality of the language, and so we were looking at whether that was affecting the rejection or at least the sending back the manuscript to the authors because of that. We were looking at whether the scope is still there, because looking at the rejection rate could be indicative, but sometimes some rejections may be justified, right? So you need to go a little bit deeper than that and understand whether your tool is indeed improving or avoiding, let's say, rejections linked to languages, linked to missing statements and things like that, right? So it's really looking also at the different reasons so that we can see, maybe if we improve the instructions on this, that could help us avoid this type of rejection and focus on the other. Sort of one way of looking at that. I think Beth mentioned it, definitely the time that it takes overall, right? And I think that's an indication of whether things were clear enough or helpful enough for the authors. Definitely, I mean, we talked about the number of times we have to sort of do this back and forth between the authors and the editorial office, for instance. Everyone agrees that that's definitely taking a lot of time. Every email is taking 2 or 3 days, and then for any questions you might ask. So we would monitor that also in addition to sort of say, I think the less back and forth, the better, absolutely. Or at least keep it to the things that are very, sort of crucial. So those would be, I think, the main things that we would monitor.
And I'd be curious to get your perspective, Xue, on if you're using these tools at submission, what sorts of things would you kind of look for to say that this is sort of working for you as a researcher? We didn't rehearse that question, so if you if you don't have an answer.
Yeah, maybe these kind of tools, maybe give some specific examples, because I feel like when I do the submission, I get very few feedback right away. It's like I said, everything just goes up in the air, and as authors, we usually just get auto-generated messages from the editorial office. And so it's like what Beth and Krishna just shared is like very good to know, because we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. So for me, it's like first time I'm hearing how they look for these, like to how they judge whether a tool is successful or not. So this is really all new to me. But I would certainly appreciate, because like I just said, we don't really know what's going on behind the scene, and I would certainly appreciate a more personal, tailored message from the editor. But I know that also adds to the workload of the editors, and the editors already have many of on their plates. So I'll leave it up to you to decide. Yeah.
All right, great. So final question, and then we'll look to wrap up and see if any more questions from the chat come in. But we'll start with Xue on this one, which is if you could change one thing about the pre-submission experience tomorrow, not in 5 years. It could be yesterday, but we'll go with tomorrow. What would that be?
Yeah, so I think I've discussed something like an interactive questionnaire, but that certainly needs some time to develop. to a final mature product. So if there's something that can be done in a more shorter time frame, I think so. This is something I'm not sure if everyone is aware of, but apparently many publishers or journals allow you to send a pre-submission inquiry to that specific journal you are interested in to see how interested they are in your work, and this saves time from doing the whole submission only to get a desk rejection saying your work is not within the scope of the journal. So I personally have not used it, but I think this kind of tools definitely deserves more attention and more spotlight and should be more available by publishers in general. But of course, this also kind of relies on the editors, the editorial office, to give a timely response to these inquiries. So yeah, this is the point I want to bring up. So I also kind of want to hear what Beth and Krishna have to say about the tools, if anyone have used them at all. I know they exist, but I have not used them myself.
Yeah, Beth?
Yeah, I mean, we're just kind of scratching the surface on our side of the industry and really just kind of taking a look at some of these tools and where they can, um, you know, really kind of help us. I use this, my staff knows this, and my team knows this, and my peers. Like we're basically in this industry. We're in flight, and we're trying to kind of fix the wing of the plane while we're in flight. And so, if we could start all over, that would be lovely to do. But I think you've got to kind of take a look at innovation and alignment with running kind of the business as usual. But I think when I think about like the one thing I could change tomorrow, to me, it's the stuff that we've kind of already have supporting in flight, and it's kind of building that better pre-submission guidance to give authors and steer them in the right direction. Again, I think Krishna was talking more common standards is what I hear from what you were saying earlier, and I kind of agree with that to a degree of looking at how we can align things that don't get at the antitrust side of things, but things that we can create more in common, because at the end of the day, I'm in the physics space, and anyone who's publishing in that area, again, we know that our researchers are publishing across all publishers in that space. So if we can give them that kind of more dynamic versus static guidelines, and I love the idea of having a built-in kind of, maybe a chat bot or something that could support you along the way and just give you the directions and guidance that you need up front to just really get you in the best position that you are in order to then for the editor to read the paper and make the important scientific decision in the end.
And last word, Krishna.
Yes, I mean, both of my colleagues have already mentioned many things. I think the one thing I could think of for myself is sort of I think the tools that we have now are a good starting point, and they are already can support when possible researchers in seeing whether something might be missing or how they would be able to rephrase that in a different way. My wish would be for the tools to be a little bit more specific to a certain extent, and I don't know if it's a matter of as was training the LLMs to with maybe the papers or similar papers where we have similar issues in the past, so that as to avoid that moving forward, so that maybe it recognizes this type of study a little bit better, something like that. It is a little bit complex because, of course, any clinical study, for instance, will be a little bit more complicated to sort of read and look at the structure. But I think maybe if we were to work more and collaborate, maybe between within the industry, that we would be able to improve that. And I think that would be it goes a little bit with the chat box. I think that's actually was someone mentioning, because then you would be able to say, or at least the chat would be able to ask you specific questions, right? And it would be able to go beyond, or is this here or not? Then you would be able to answer such questions so that you could go to a slightly higher level of complexity for your studies, where I think is really the difficulty maybe sometimes to really know what you really need and how you should present it. So I think, yes, it's maybe some closer collaboration and maybe a better sort of training of the tools based on sort of other similar papers, so that the help is not just very general, but can be also very specific to the manuscript that you are submitting.
All right. Beth, Krishna, Chu-Wei, thank you for participating, and I really appreciate you setting aside an hour of your time to chat with us on this topic, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at SSP. We have, if you're attending or soon or at some other venue, we do have another webinar upcoming. I think Andreas is still on the call to throw that up. So we will be talking with Paul Tunenberg from Global Campus on what makes semantic matching possible from scope check to the right reviewer. And that is going to be on May 19th at 3 p.m. So hopefully we will see you there, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.